Hi, I'm Max Rodriguez, and this is Writers on Writing. Today, we're speaking with Glaude Jr., Princeton University professor of religion and African American studies and author of Democracy in Black: How Race Still Enslaves the American Soul. So, Eddie, you have a new title, Democracy in Black: How Race Still Enslaves the American Soul.
Right.
Tell us about the idea of democracy in black.
Right, so, it comes out of this really dimension of our tradition, this really intense dimension of our tradition, where we're thinking about what democracy means, how our presence complicates the articulation of the principles of freedom, liberty, right, and representation, equality. And in some ways, what it does, it takes that Lincoln's kind of definition of American democracy as a government of the people, for the people, and by the people. I'm not quite in that order. But it takes that frame and expands the very notion of who those people are. And so it's precisely in that context of a country founded on principles of liberty and the institution of slavery, and how those who are children of those who were enslaved offer a vision of what democracy actually is, shorn of the idea that white people are valued more than others. And so Democracy in Black has always been about an assertion of the principles of democracy, of the idea of democracy, apart from white supremacy, apart from the value gap.
So we also often talk about an idea being imposed upon, an idea of being imposed upon people of color. But as you just said, the idea of democracy never included people of color.
In this context.
In
right?
this context. Right. So is it not that the resistance that we receive is our attempt to impose ourselves within a concept in which we were never originally included?
Right. It all depends on if we understand the concepts as static, as not dynamic, as not having, in some interesting sort of way, being impacted by the vagaries of history. So, there's a wonderful line by the great theologian Howard Thurman with regards to African American enslaved people who embraced Christianity, that they dared to redeem the religion profaned in their midst. So here we are as modern folk, entered the modern world as someone else's belongings in some ways, right? And how have we, in some ways, kind of built, created a life world, right, in that context, with principles, with ideas that are tethered to our experience, that are rooted from where we came, but are kind of also grounded from where we arrived. And it's in that synergy that we sound a particular note. So it's almost as if the best example would be, we invented the blues scale. And we take that scale, and at the heart of it is the most unstable chords you can imagine, but we create a sound that's distinctly modern. And so part of the way in which we understand African Americans and their embrace, our embrace of democracy, is how we give it a blues sound, how we make it swing, right? How we give it a kind of depth that's rooted in our experience, in our journey. So democracy as an idea, as an ideal, as a concept, is not the possession, right, of those who claim Greece, right? It's the possession of those of us who claim a way of being in the world in which we want to emphasize the capacities of everyday, ordinary people, not only to dream dreams, but to make those dreams a reality.
So let's talk more about the book itself.
Got it.
In the book, you talk about the Great Black Depression.
Yeah.
Just create that distinction for us.
Right, so we talk about the recession of 2008, and you remember the language around that, right? We haven't seen an economic collapse like this since the Great Depression. But when you look at the data and you look at what happened in Black America, it was in fact a depression. When you look at 240,000 homes lost as a result of the collapse of the housing market. And those 240,000 homes were directly tied to the wealth in Black communities. In my own mind, I don't think we've seen a collapse of Black wealth since the collapse of the Freedmen's Bank. So most of black wealth located in their homes, predatory lending, the ways in which African Americans found themselves pushed to these loans that were ballooning mortgages. And so many people found themselves having to pay mortgages that they could no longer afford. And then you combine that with skyrocketing unemployment. Right, in certain places in New York, certain places in Michigan, certain places in D.C., 50% of black men below the age of 25 were unemployed. And so you begin to think about that, and you combine that with downward mobility. Black families who worked hard, played by the rules, quote unquote, found themselves moving down into poverty. And because there's no social safety net, because of the attack on federal government by Republicans and Democrats, they had nowhere to fall. So when we look at the data, 38% of American children are in poverty, but when you look at our children in places like Mississippi, 38% of black children in poverty, 50% of black children in Mississippi live in poverty. Throughout the South, over 45%. So it's not just simply a moment of an occurrence in the present, it has generational implications. When we think about white wealth now is 13 times that of black wealth. People are talking about that we've turned a corner, that we've come out of the Great Recession of 2008. But when I looked around our communities, when I looked at my family, I still see people struggling. I still see the ruins, right? And what I wanted to do in Democracy in Black is try to talk about how is that possible, that people can make the argument that pundits and politicians can say that we've turned the corner, we've come out of the Great Recession, and we're in ruins. Well, it must be because we're disposable, and that disposability is invisible.
So speaking about disposability, you speak also in your book about racial habits.
Right.
So racial habits, whatever they may be, are generally background driven.
Right.
They're inculcated into us. We do them oftentimes unknowingly. Mm-hmm. Tell us more about racial habits.
So racial habits are they're the fuel of the value gap. And the value gap is this idea, right, that white people matter more than others. We talk about the achievement gap, we talk about the wealth gap, we talk about the empathy gap, but underneath it is the belief that white people matter more. And that belief has organized our society, organized this country since its founding, reconciling the principles of freedom, liberty, and equality with the institution of racial slavery. That's the value gap. The political scientist, late Judith Sklar at Harvard, said that America is the only modern constitutional democracy founded with slavery. So it really wasn't liberal or a democracy until the passage of the Civil War amendments. I would push it back even further. It wasn't really a democracy or a liberal society until the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act of 64, 65. So the value gap. The value gap is this belief. It organizes our cultural practices. It organizes our political and economic realities, and it's sustained by racial habits. Now, what are these racial habits? This background stuff. I like to use the example. My dad was the second African-American hired at the post office in Pascagoula, Mississippi. And he knew he had precocious kids, so he moved us from one side of town to the other. And I was playing with my Tonka truck. And my white friend's dad yelled out, "Stop playing with that nigger." It is the first time I have been called that in this context, right? And I told my father, and my father, you could see the past of Mississippi kind of descend on him, and he ran outside. And we typically tell the story of American racism in that way. A family achieves the American dream, buys a big house on the hill, a child is wounded by a mean-spirited adult, then that child has to spend the rest of her life proving that she's not bad. But that's too easy, because I already knew at the age of 8 that we were moving from the black side of town to the white side of town. Because in my old neighborhood, when it rained, because the pipes were bad, the neighborhood flooded. The sidewalks weren't paved. The houses were smaller. The schools weren't as good. The community was subject to layoffs by Ingalls Shipyard and Chevron, right? The baseball park wasn't cut. Everything in this spatial environment led me to believe, taught me, inculcated, socialized, habituated me into the idea that this community was valued less than the community across the tracks. So racial habits evidence themselves in the very spaces we move about, right? In New York, you just drive New York, you're learning race. in Princeton, where I work. You just walk down Witherspoon Street and move from Princeton all the way down to the immigrant community, where you have a number of Latino populations that have been raided by INS, right? You see and you learn race, not by loud races, but by the way in which we're habituated. And we also see it in the way in which we interact with each other. So these are the habits that shape our perceptions, inform our fears, and those fears then justify policy in our actions.
So then where to from that? That sounds so deeply rooted. So let's talk about those fears. In your book, there's a chapter on white fear. Let's talk about that and its impact. If there's white fear, what is the black fear? And how does black fear sort of support the existence of the white fear?
Oh, absolutely. So you're right. So at the heart of the book, let me say this though before I get to white. At the heart of the book is this rejection of this framing, that the problem is the gap between our ideals and our practices. This is the frame that was set forth in Gunnar Myrdal's 1944 book, The American Dilemma. And it has informed how we've talked about race relations in this country ever since. That the problem isn't that America has built the country true. The problem is that we don't live up to our ideals. Now, as a philosopher, this is just a very odd understanding of practice and agency. That is to say, if we look at your practice and your practices constantly reveal a set of commitments that run contrary to your ideals, then we ought to believe that those practices are actually indicative of what you actually believe, not the ideals that you're positing. Right? Otherwise, it's just bad faith. So part of what I'm suggesting is that we're not talking about more perfecting the Union. We're not talking about America as the shining city on the hill. Those American exceptionalist frames, they constrain how we talk and how we think. What I'm more interested in is who we are as a people. What kind of person are you? The value gap and racial habits distort your characters, and democracies require particular kinds of people to work. So the dispositions that have been cultivated in this country aren't dispositions that are conducive for a genuine democratic society. How is that made manifest? Not only through habits, but through our fears. From the very beginning, in Thomas Jefferson's notes of the state of Virginia, the moment, that famous phrase where he's worrying about the country, what God will do for the sin of slavery, in effect. And that chapter is a chapter, when he writes that claim, it's actually in a chapter on habit formation. What's happening to the child of the slaveholder who witnesses violence? His character is being distorted and disfigured in that moment. So Jefferson worries about divine retribution for the sin of slavery, fear, driving, right? Or Abraham Lincoln in the second inaugural, some consider it the second founding, reads the Civil War as God's punishment for the sin of slavery, right? Fear, divine retribution. And then, of course, there's the fear of black revenge, right? Haiti has been paying for it ever since. Toussaint Louverture and Dessalines, right? They've been paying for rebelling against the first modern black nation in the Western world, has never been forgiven for its revolt and rebellion, right? And of course, that fear of black revenge makes its way not only from Haiti, but to the Black Panther Party, to even today, where black folk can't be angry for fear that somehow we will stoke the fires of revenge, right? But the interesting thing about that, though, getting to your point, is that our fear of white fear, black fear of white fear, leads us to mask. We don't want to be exposed as being black. We want to make people comfortable. As I say in the book, we have to become the Uncle Remus of American politics. That is to say, generally happy, loyal, and non-threatening. Right? Mm-hmm. So our fear of white fear distorts our political behavior such that we won't tell the truth.
Mm. You say in your book that the task at hand is not about securing the goodness of the American idea. Mm. It is about according dignity and standing to all Americans, no matter the color of their skin.
Yeah. See, that's the thing. You know, we just heard all of that American idea stuff over the course of those the conventions, particularly and ironically at the Democratic convention. in July. And what was fascinating is that there was this kind of morning in America kind of language. This is the greatest nation on the planet. Joe Biden even said way back then, right, even said this was going to be the American century, right? And part of that rhetoric blinds us to the work, the difficult work that is needed to confront the ugliness of who we are. Because the American idea, in my view, keeps us in a perpetual state of adolescence, right? It's like Never Never Land, where nobody wants to be responsible because we're always already great. We're always already on the way to a more perfect union. So what the American idea do, what it does, right? It neuters, right? It blunts any substantive critique. The late, great Sack Van Berkovich talks about the American ideology and how it absorbs critique and makes it all about America, right? And once you concede those claims, once you concede those terms, you're done, right? And so I refuse to argue on those grounds. I'm too much like Jimmy Baldwin. I want us to argue. I want to have an argument about who do we take ourselves to be as persons, as individuals, as groups, right? That sort of thing.
Going to politics, you also stated that in 2008 and in 2012, Obama sold Black America the snake oil of hope and change.
Yeah, I call him a Melvillian confidence man.
My goodness.
Yeah.
Say more.
I've gotten in a lot of trouble about that.
Yes.
And part of what, before President Obama became president, when he was a senator, remember all of that energy around the anti-Iraq war demonstrations, hundreds of thousands of people all across the United States demonstrating against the war effort, millions of people all across the world demonstrating against U.S. intervention in Iraq. If we recall the kind of rhetoric around George W. Bush from the left, right, and you saw organizing across the country, and even before that, WTO, and the protest around in Seattle, and what that suggested. And then President Obama jumped in front of that energy and became its object, right? And so all of that grassroots energy was channeled into his presidency, and with the hope that he was in fact representative of change. When in fact, if we read the Audacity of Hope closely, he is who he has said he's always been. He's a centrist liberal, right? And so he told us he was going to change the frame, but he didn't change the frame at all. He triangulated, right? He's a corporate Democrat. Wall Street has recovered record profits. Main Street still suffering, wages flatline. He wants to pass TPP, which will devastate workers, which will definitely devastate Black workers. We haven't heard a peep from him about 15, Fight for 15, which would disproportionately impact Black and brown communities. And then on top of that, when it comes to all the death and sadness, as we've seen in this haunting public ritual of Black grief, as we've witnessed all of our babies and uncles and aunts and friends murdered at the hands of police and at the hands of people who want to be police, right? He hasn't changed the frame. It's kind of equivalency. On the one hand here, on the other hand there. And so if you want to position yourself as someone who is an advocate of hope and change, and then we judge that rhetoric against the reality of your record, then one could conclude without hyperbole that you were selling snake oil.
You also presented the idea of disremembering.
Yeah.
And what you wrote was disremembering is active forgetting.
Yeah.
So I have a couple of questions for you there. One is, please say more about that. But are you suggesting that Black people disremember?
Yeah, that's such a great question, Max. All nations tell a particular story about themselves. Every nation has a way of narrating its past. And oftentimes that story is told in such a way to accent the virtue and downplay the vice. And it's about orienting us, right, to the national project in such a way that it could evidence itself in patriotism. It could evidence itself in a kind of loyalty in which one would risk one's life for that nation state. So the United States is not unique in the way in which it disremembers, but it's unique in the way in which it tries to manage and disremember its racial past. So you can imagine Woodrow Wilson calling at the anniversary of the Civil War, holding a major memorial where he invites veterans from the South and veterans from the Confederacy and veterans from the Union Army, and he talks about we are one Union, right? Putting behind, right, the most devastating war at that point that the world had seen at that point. And at the moment in which he's engaged in that moment of reconciliation, it is a ritual that presupposes active disremembering, because black people are being lynched at alarming rates at the same time that the memorial is happening. So there's active disremembering in order to forget our sins. And what I say in the book is that active disremembering also reveals the limits of our conception of justice. Right?
I must ask that.
Sure.
If black people might consider disremembering, shouldn't whites as well be allowed to disremember?
Well, I mean, look, there's that wonderful, I get the word from Toni Morrison's Beloved. And there's the ending of the novel where Sethe, who has literally been haunted and consumed by the embodied past, which is the ghost of Beloved, a baby that she murders to prevent her from returning to slavery. Sethe says this is not a story to pass on, although she's told the story. And Friedrich Nietzsche makes the point in his text that if we don't cultivate the ability to remember, we arrest our ability to act, to disremember. We arrest our ability to act. So there are moments where you have to, in order to get up in the morning, right, hold certain things at bay. But if you're in a position of power, if you are in some ways the inheritor of those who have caused so much suffering and pain, right, to forget is actually an intimate ritual to assuage your conscience, to tell yourself that you are somehow something other than who you actually are. In James Baldwin's words, is to protect your innocence. And as Baldwin says in The Fire Next Time, it's the innocence is the crime. You want to walk around as if you haven't done anything, as if your hands are clean, as if you're the shining city on the hill, when all of this devastation, right, rests at your feet.
And that pretty much sounds to be sort of the foundation of Mandela's reconciliation project. That's right. So you can stop telling the story, but first tell us the story. Tell us how you are complicit, were complicit within the story, right, and then we can release it.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about, we talk about African American unemployment in this country. We talk about a range of, there's a standard kind of critique of black folk as trading in victimhood, victimology, that black folk are lazy, and there's no recognition of the history of a dual labor market in this country, where we were locked out of certain jobs. My daddy could not have gone to Princeton as late as 1963, 64, right? Or a dual housing market. The fact that we were locked out of certain kinds of mortgages for so long, which is the source of wealth of the American middle class coming out of World War II, that we were locked out of that, right? And somehow all of that, those historical realities don't matter. It's just we don't want to work. We're lazy. Right? We don't take care of our homes. We don't want to own anything, or we don't want to go and learn. And you just kind of say, wait a minute, somebody's missing something here. You're not telling yourself the right story. And part of a certain kind of radical politics involves re-narrating, telling a better story, because oftentimes the stories we tell reveal our characters.
And lastly, in your book, you speak about a revolution of values.
Yeah.
So tell us, what would a revolution of values look like, and who would it impact and how?
Yeah, so if I say that the country has been built true, that this is not about a gap between our practices and our ideals, that what we see is a country built to reflect the value gap, that white people are valued more than others. And to the extent to which that's true, no matter what the inputs are, the outputs will be the same. We will always have racial inequality. Now, what we see, I'm on my way to answering your question, Max, what we see is that white workers are now suffering from an economic philosophy that doesn't quite care about their whiteness. Right? So they are now confronting the fact that their wages are flatlined, that their homes aren't worth anything, that they can't afford college and university for their kids, that in some ways their ability to dream dreams has been in some ways undermined, right, by an economic philosophy that is only concerned about the wealthiest of the wealthy. So they are standing on unstable ground, and in some ways looking to those others who are supposedly taking away from their ability to imagine a better life for themselves. So they're scapegoating black folk, and they're scapegoating immigrants and Muslims and a range of other things because they're afraid. So if the country's true, and if we are in this crisis, then we need a revolution. We're going to have to upend some things. And so we're going to have to
That's a value-laden word.
Of course. That's why it's a revolution of value. And it comes out of my reading of Dr. King's Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community, where he calls for a revolution of values. I call it a revolution of value. He calls it a revolution of values. And what he's talking about in that moment is that we have to critique capitalism. We have to reject a certain understanding of crony capitalism. We have to reject militarism, and we have to reject racism or white supremacy. I say if we're going to have a revolution of value, we've got to change our view of government. We change our view of government by changing our demand of government, our expectation of government. We have to change our view of black people. In order to change our view of black people, we've got to change our view of white people. And only white people can kill the idea of white people. And then we have to change what ultimately matters. We can't have a country organized around selfishness, greed, and narcissism, because if we do, we will produce even more
of the same.
Trump is just an exaggeration of the rot that's at the heart of the country. He's not the problem. He's just an indication of the problem.
Question, because revolution is so energetic.
Yeah, great word.
Might we consider not a revolution of values, but simply an evolution of values? Okay.
No, I think what we have to do is fundamentally reorder how we live our lives in this country. And all revolutions are evolutionary in some sense. And part of what we have to do, I think, is everyday ordinary people, all of us, because racial habits are evidenced in the way you and I behave, not just white folks. Right? I tell my students all the time, white supremacy doesn't require white people to work, right? And it's certainly the case that the value gap doesn't require loud racists to work. All of us are implicated. And so what we have to do is come to the conclusion, Max, that our current way of life is no longer sustainable. That we cannot live in a country where people are working harder for less. We can't live in a country where a notion of the public good has been completely eviscerated, where the role of politicians is simply to convince us that transferring public dollars into private hands is actually in our best interest. We can't live in a country where public education, right, has become the latest space, right, to try to transfer public dollars into private hands, where we're not educating all of our children. We can't bomb people around the world into oblivion, right? The way in which we live our lives is no longer sustainable. And until we make that judgment, which will require us to fundamentally change who we take ourselves to be, then we will find ourselves in another generation, right, in the same place where we are right now.
I think that's a wonderful place to leave this conversation, Eddie. Thank you so much for your book, for your work, for your vision, and what you hold as true for America.
I appreciate it.
The book, Democracy in Black. The author, Eddie Glaude Jr. We hope you enjoyed the program. We hope you enjoyed Writers on Writing. Please visit us on our Facebook page, our YouTube channel, and on QBR.com.